Sirens tore through the morning air as black SUVs slammed to a stop in front of the courthouse. Cameras surged forward like a wave. Protesters screamed. Someone threw a paper cup that burst against the marble steps. And right at the center of it all, Catherine Whitmore stepped out of the car like the chaos had nothing to do with her. She wore white, not bridal white, but power white. Clean lines, perfect tailoring, unmistakably expensive, the kind of luxury that whispered power instead of shouting it. Her posture was calm, her face composed, her beauty sharp enough to silence a room when she chose to let it. She paused, adjusted her sunglasses, then turned back toward the open door. The man who stepped out beside her didn't blend in. He couldn't have if he tried. Tall, dark, muscular, his presence shifted the space around him. His suit was borrowed, slightly tight across the shoulders, but he wore it with the kind of dignity money couldn't buy. His name was Elijah Brooks, and in less than 10 minutes, Catherine Whitmore, billionaire, philanthropist, untouchable, was about to marry a man the world had already decided was invisible. The shouting exploded instantly. "This is fake. She's lost her mind. How much did she pay him?" Catherine took 2 steps forward, then stopped. She turned toward the cameras and slid her sunglasses off slowly. Her eyes were steady, cold almost, not angry, not afraid. "This isn't a stunt," she said evenly. "It's the most honest thing I've ever done." That only made it worse. Someone screamed at the man beside her, demanding he say something, demanding an explanation, a confession, a punchline. He glanced sideways at her, just for a second, quietly asked whether she wanted him to speak. She shook her head slightly. Let them talk. And they did. They always did. 3 weeks earlier, the boardroom had gone silent in a way Catherine recognized immediately. This wasn't respect, it was discomfort. She sat at the head of the glass table, legs crossed, fingers loosely folded. Her suit was charcoal gray, custom fitted, the kind of outfit designed to end arguments before they started. On the screen at the far end of the room, a talk show host leaned forward, smiling like he thought he had her cornered. He praised her foundation, her speeches, her donations, then asked, politely, whether it wasn't easy to talk about equality when you never lived without privilege. Catherine didn't hesitate. Equality wasn't about personal suffering. It was about principles, about systems, about fairness, she said. The host nodded, then tilted his head, asked if she would marry someone society considered beneath her. A few people in the room laughed, not because it was funny, because they didn't know what else to do. Catherine asked him to define beneath. He hesitated, then said it anyway. Homeless, poor, black, powerless. The smile never reached her eyes. "Yes," she said. The laughter stopped. When he asked if she was serious, she repeated it. Calm, clear, no qualifiers. Yes. 2 nights later, Catherine stood outside her own headquarters just after midnight. No security detail, no cameras, no assistants begging her to reconsider. Just cold air, city noise, and a decision she had already made. She saw him sitting near the steps, upright, alert, not asleep. His eyes tracked movement automatically like someone who had learned the hard way to stay ready. She asked if he slept there. He looked up slowly and asked who was asking. When she gave her name, he laughed once, short and disbelieving, said, "Of course you are." She told him she wanted to make an offer. He stood, tall, solid, calm in a way that wasn't relaxed but controlled, said he didn't take pity. "Good," she replied, "neither do I." Then she told him she wanted to marry him. The silence stretched long enough for the city to breathe between them. He said she didn't even know his name. She asked him to tell her. "Elijah," he said. She repeated it, then told him she wasn't offering love, she was offering a spotlight, a collision between two worlds that pretended not to see each other. He asked what happened when he got burned by it. She met his gaze and laid it out plainly. Permanent housing, medical care, legal protection, and funding. His eyes shifted past her then toward the others watching from the shadows. He said this wasn't a marriage. She agreed. It was a statement. He asked what happened when she was done proving her point. She told him she would still keep her word. He studied her for a long moment, then warned her not to expect gratitude. She told him she didn't. Now, inside the courthouse, the noise vanished as the doors closed behind them. The air felt heavier, almost sacred. He adjusted the borrowed suit, tugging slightly at the sleeves. She noticed immediately and said, "It will be tailored." "You don't have to fix everything," he said quietly. "I fix problems. That's what I do." The officiant's hands shook as he asked whether they enter this union willingly. "Yes," she said without hesitation. When it was his turn, he paused just long enough for doubt to ripple through the room. Then he nodded. Yes. There was no kiss, no music, no applause, just ink on paper, a signature that detonated across the world. The mansion was too quiet. He stood in the doorway, taking in the marble floors, the glass walls, the grand piano that looked like it had never been played. "I'll sleep in the guest wing," he said. "Of course," she replied. She added that this was temporary. "Everything is," he said. By morning, the consequences arrived. Sponsors pulled out, stock prices dipped, headlines sharpened their knives. Her phone rang nonstop. An assistant finally whispered that people were calling it a breakdown. Catherine stared out over the city she had built her empire on. "Good," she said. Downstairs, a housekeeper smiled at Elijah as he passed. He smiled back. For the first time in years, he was inside, and the world had already decided to tear them apart. By the end of the first week, the world had made up its mind. Catherine Whitmore hadn't married a man. She had committed a scandal. Her face was everywhere. News panels argued over her sanity. Social media dissected every frame of the courthouse footage, slowing it down, zooming in, replaying the moment Elijah stepped out of the car like it was evidence in a trial. Some called it brave. Most called it disgusting. The phone rang before sunrise. Her assistant's voice came tight and rehearsed, like someone trying not to panic. Sponsors were pulling out, major ones. The board wanted an emergency meeting. Lawyers were already on standby. Catherine listened in silence, sipping her coffee. "Schedule it," she said finally. "All of them." Downstairs, Elijah sat at the long kitchen table, hands wrapped around a mug. The mansion staff moved around him carefully, polite but distant, unsure of how to behave around a man who didn't belong in their world but now lived in its center. A young housekeeper hesitated before speaking, asked if he needed anything. He smiled and said no, but thanked her anyway. That smile lingered with her long after she walked away. The boardroom felt smaller than it used to. Men and women Catherine had built fortunes beside now avoided her eyes. One of them didn't even sit down. "This is spiraling," someone said immediately. "We're hemorrhaging confidence." "You blindsided us," another added. "This isn't activism, it's sabotage." Catherine leaned back in her chair, calm, composed, almost bored. "What exactly are you afraid of?" she asked. "That the world sees what it's always been?" A man slammed his hand on the table, said this wasn't a philosophy class, this was business. She reminded them that their profits were built on image just as much as performance, that discomfort didn't equal damage. A woman across from her shook her head, said the damage was already done. Investors didn't like unpredictability, and this marriage, she gestured vaguely, was chaos. Catherine smiled faintly. "Then perhaps the problem isn't the marriage," she said. "Perhaps it's what it's revealing." Silence answered her. They voted anyway. Not to remove her, not yet, but they stripped her of temporary control over several divisions, called it a cooling-off period. When Catherine stood to leave, no one followed. At home that night, she found Elijah standing in front of the grand piano. He wasn't playing it, just staring at it. "Do you play?" she asked, more out of habit than curiosity. He shrugged, said he used to. She told him it had never been tuned properly, that it was mostly decorative. "That's a waste," he said quietly. She didn't disagree. He asked how bad the meeting was. She told him the truth, that people were scared, that money hated unpredictability. He nodded like that made sense. "They always panic when something doesn't stay in its place," he said. She studied him for a moment, asked if he was adjusting. He said adjustment was a luxury, that you learn to accept environments quickly when you didn't get to choose them. She didn't know how to respond to that. Instead, she reminded him that the guest wing was fully stocked, that he could ask for anything. He looked at her, curious. "Do you ever ask for anything?" The question caught her off guard. "I don't need to," she said. He smiled, but there was something in it that made her uncomfortable. "That's not the same thing," he replied. The backlash got uglier. Someone leaked footage of Elijah before the wedding, sleeping on cardboard, wrapped in a thin blanket. The caption called it proof. Proof that Catherine had gone too far. Proof that some lines shouldn't be crossed. Pundits debated whether she was exploiting him or whether he was exploiting her. Neither side bothered to ask him. Catherine found him in the gym one afternoon. He was lifting weights like he'd done it his whole life, controlled movements, no wasted energy. "You're disciplined," she said. "Discipline is survival," he replied. She hesitated, then asked why he'd never asked her for money or clothes or anything else. He set the weights down slowly. "I didn't agree to this to be owned," he said. She felt something tighten in her chest. "That's not what this is." "I know, but it's close enough to make me careful." That night, she overheard staff whispering. Some were angry, some confused, a few defended him. "He says good morning, every day," one said quietly. Catherine stood still in the hallway, listening. She wasn't sure why it mattered, but it did. The first crack appeared a few days later. It happened during a dinner with donors she couldn't afford to lose. The room glittered with wealth, dresses, watches, laughter that didn't quite sound sincere. Elijah sat beside her, posture straight, hands folded, silent unless spoken to. A man across the table smirked and asked where Elijah learned his manners. Elijah replied, "The same place everyone else does, by watching people who don't have them." The table froze. Catherine hid her smile behind her glass. Later, in the car, she asked where he learned to speak like that. "Books," he said. "Listening." She pressed, asked what he'd done before the streets. He looked out the window. "Does it matter?" She told him it did to her. He was quiet for a long moment, then said, "Another time." She didn't push, but she didn't forget. That night, Catherine couldn't sleep. She found herself replaying moments she'd dismissed at first. The way Elijah corrected a lawyer's Latin phrase under his breath. The way he'd navigated donor conversations without ever sounding impressed or intimidated. This wasn't just intelligence, it was training. She went to his guest wing after midnight and knocked. He answered immediately, like he'd been awake. "You don't sleep much," she said. "Neither do you," he replied. She asked him again who he was before the streets. He studied her face carefully, then shook his head. "You didn't marry my past. You married what the world thinks I am." "That's not the deal," she said. He stepped aside to let her in anyway. "You wanted a mirror," he said softly. "Be careful what you see in it." For the first time since this began, Catherine felt something she hadn't planned for, unease. Because mirrors don't just reflect the world, they reflect you. The first time Catherine saw him play the piano wasn't on purpose. She had been on the phone in her office, pacing, arguing with someone who no longer believed in her vision. The call ended abruptly. She stood there for a moment, exhausted, staring out at the city lights. Then she heard it. Soft at first, careful, like someone testing whether they were allowed to exist. She froze. The sound drifted through the open doors, filling the empty hallways of the mansion. The piano no one touched, the piano she'd called decorative. She followed the music. Elijah sat at the bench, shoulders relaxed, fingers moving with quiet precision, not flashy, not hesitant, confident in a way that came from long familiarity. The melody was old, classical, clean. She didn't interrupt. When he finished, the silence felt heavy again. She finally spoke, asking where he learned to play like that. He stood slowly, as if suddenly aware where he was, said it had been a long time, said he was rusty. That wasn't rust, she said. He smiled faintly, not proud, almost sad. She asked where he learned. He hesitated, then said his mother insisted that she believed discipline and beauty were forms of protection. Catherine leaned against the doorway, arms crossed. "Your mother sounds intentional." "She had to be," he said. "The world wasn't gentle." Something shifted then. The story she'd built in her head didn't fit as neatly anymore. The next few weeks blurred together. Public outrage cooled into something more dangerous: mockery. Late-night hosts joked about her marriage. Cartoons depicted her dragging Elijah through charity galas like a prop. Catherine pretended it didn't bother her, but she noticed how Elijah absorbed it all without complaint, without bitterness. He read everything, watched everything, said almost nothing. One evening, she found him on the terrace, staring out at the city. She asked if he was angry. He said anger took energy he couldn't afford to waste. She asked if he regretted agreeing to this. He looked at her then, really looked. "No," he said, "but I regret how predictable they are." She laughed. "They?" she asked. "The ones who think this marriage is about them," he replied. The first real fight happened over something small. She'd scheduled a photo shoot without telling him. Magazine cover, carefully styled, carefully framed. He stood in the hallway, arms crossed, listening as she explained why it mattered. "This helps control the narrative," she said. "It keeps them from inventing one worse." He shook his head slowly. "You didn't ask." "I didn't think I needed to." "That's the problem," he said quietly. "Everyone thinks they don't need to ask." She snapped back that this wasn't personal, that it was strategic. He stepped closer, not threatening, just present. "Strategy without consent is just control wearing a better suit." The words landed harder than she expected. She told him he could walk away from the shoot. He smiled without humor. "And confirm everything they think about me?" She didn't answer. The shoot happened. He didn't complain, but something cooled between them afterward. That distance didn't last. One night, she found him in the kitchen cooking. Actually cooking. Not reheating, not improvising. She raised an eyebrow. "You cook now too?" "Always have," he said. "Hunger teaches creativity." She watched him move, confident and efficient. "Who were you?" she asked quietly. He stopped, didn't turn around. "You keep asking that, and you keep avoiding it." He exhaled slowly. "Because once you know, you can't take it back." She told him she could handle the truth. He looked at her then, eyes sharp. "Can you handle your place in it?" The question unsettled her more than any accusation. The turning point came on a rainy afternoon. Catherine's foundation was hosting a legal aid clinic downtown, a gesture meant to calm critics. She invited Elijah without thinking. He agreed immediately. At the clinic, she watched something she hadn't seen before. He spoke to people like he recognized them. Not pity, not charity, recognition. He listened more than he spoke. When he did speak, people leaned in. A young man asked a question about an eviction notice. Elijah answered calmly, explaining tenant law in plain language, explained timelines, rights, options. Catherine frowned. "That was detailed," she said afterward. He shrugged. "Information keeps people alive." She asked how he knew all that. He smiled faintly. You don't forget things that once mattered. That night, she searched his name. Nothing. No records, no past, no digital footprint beyond the wedding. That should have been impossible. She confronted him in the study. You don't exist. He leaned against the desk. Most people like it that way. No, she said. I mean literally. There's nothing. No college, no work history, no arrests, no social media. That doesn't happen by accident. He watched her carefully. Maybe I didn't want to be found. She asked if he was running from something. He said no. Then what? He was quiet for a long moment. Erasure, he said finally. The word hung between them. She pressed him. He told her some people get punished for telling the truth, that sometimes the punishment isn't prison, it's disappearance. She asked who did that to him. He looked at her in a way that made her stomach tighten. People like you, he said softly, whether you meant to or not. She felt the room tilt. That's not fair, she said. Truth rarely is. Later that night, she sat alone in her office, documents spread across her desk. Contracts, old investments, housing projects she'd funded years ago without reading past the executive summary. She felt something cold settle in her chest. For the first time since this began, Catherine wondered if she had misunderstood the entire story, and worse, if she was standing on the wrong side of it. Catherine didn't sleep that night. The word Elijah had used kept echoing in her head, erasure. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't emotional. It was precise, like a legal term, like something chosen carefully. By morning, she was sitting at her desk with files spread out in front of her, scrolling through old investments she hadn't looked at in years. Housing developments, urban renewal projects, partnerships brokered through third parties. Clean on the surface, profitable, applauded. She'd trusted the summaries. She always had. Now she was reading the fine print. Her phone buzzed, another message from her legal team asking if she wanted to respond to the latest accusations online. She ignored it. Downstairs, she heard movement, footsteps, drawers opening. She found Elijah in the kitchen again, pouring coffee like this was his house too now, like he belonged. She didn't waste time. You knew who I was before I met you. He didn't look surprised. Yes. The word landed softly, no hesitation, no denial. Her chest tightened. How long? Long enough. She asked why he hadn't said anything. You didn't ask the right question. You asked who I was, not why I was there. She gripped the edge of the counter. You let me think I was choosing this. You were. You just weren't the only one making a choice. Anger surged, sharp and sudden. She accused him of manipulation, of using her outrage, her pride, her ego. He listens calmly. When powerful people say they want to prove a point, someone always becomes the example. She stared at him. So that's what I am to you? He met her gaze. You're the door that finally opened. He didn't give her everything at once. He never did. He started with the beginning. Years ago, he'd been a civil rights attorney. Not famous, not rich, but relentless. He worked housing cases, evictions, predatory development, the kind of legal work that made enemies quietly. He had discovered patterns, entire neighborhoods displaced through shell companies and rushed permits, public housing sold under the language of revitalization, communities erased with paperwork instead of violence. He'd followed the money. It led everywhere, including to corporations Catherine had invested in, companies her foundation had once praised for urban innovation. I didn't think you were evil, he said. I thought you were careless. That hurt more than any accusation. He told her about the lawsuit he'd prepared, the evidence he'd gathered, how, weeks before filing, his firm dropped him, how his license was challenged, how witnesses disappeared. Then his accounts were frozen. Then his name stopped working. No charges, he said. No trial. Just silence. He tried to fight it, took contract work, then odd jobs, then shelters, then the streets. And no one noticed, he said, because people like me vanish easily. Catherine felt sick. She whispered that she hadn't known. "I know," he replied. "That's the worst part." She spent the next 2 days in a fog. She canceled meetings, ignored calls, let headlines rot without response. Instead, she dug. She used her access, her resources, her reputation. What she found confirmed everything. Shell companies, deliberate obfuscation, legal gray zones engineered to be deniable. Her money hadn't built the wrecking ball, but it had paid for the gloves. She confronted her legal team. They deflected, minimized, told her this was standard practice, that responsibility was diffuse. That was when she understood the real crime. Not theft, not corruption. Distance. That night, she found Elijah in the study, packing documents into a bag. "What are you doing?" she asked. "Preparing," he said. "For what?" "For when this stops being quiet." She told him she was in, that she would testify, that she would expose everything. He looked at her for a long moment. "You don't understand what that costs," he said. "I'm starting to." He shook his head. "No, I mean everything." She swallowed. "Then I'll pay it." The explosion came 3 days later, not from Catherine, from Elijah. The documents went public before dawn, evidence packaged cleanly, timelines, financial trails, names. By noon, the world was on fire. Stocks plunged, executives resigned, government agencies announced investigations, and Catherine Whitmore's name was everywhere. Some called her brave, others called her a traitor. Her board demanded a meeting immediately. This time, she walked in knowing it was over. They told her she'd been deceived, that she was a victim. She told them she wasn't. She told them she signed off on things she didn't understand because understanding would have slowed her down. They offered her an exit, a chance to distance herself, to blame her husband. She stood. "I married the truth," she said. "I'm not divorcing it now." She resigned before they could vote. That evening, the house was surrounded by cameras, shouting, headlines updating by the minute. Inside, it was dark. Elijah sat alone on the kitchen floor, back against the cabinet. Not because there weren't chairs, because the floor felt honest. His phone lay face down beside him. He'd stopped reading the messages hours ago. Threats, accusations, strangers calling him a fraud, others calling him a hero. Both felt wrong. His hands rested loosely between his knees, still, too still. The adrenaline from the morning had burnt out. What was left wasn't triumph, it was weight. Catherine found him there by accident. She had come downstairs for water. She didn't speak at first. She had never seen him small in a room, not physically, emotionally. "You did what you came to do," she said quietly. He let out a breath that almost sounded like a laugh. "Did I?" There was no sharpness in it, just fatigue. She stepped closer. "You exposed them." He nodded once. "And now?" he asked. The question wasn't strategic. It was real. She didn't answer. He ran his hand over his face slowly. "I keep thinking," he said, voice lower now. "What if nothing changes?" The words slipped out before he could contain them. He swallowed. "What if they replace a few names, reshuffle a few boards, and call it reform?" His jaw tightened. "What if I burned everything down just to warm the same room?" There it was. Not anger, fear. He finally looked at her. "And what if I turned you into collateral?" That landed between them. For the first time, he didn't look like the architect of the plan. He looked like a man who had gambled and wasn't sure the cost was justified. Catherine stepped down and sat on the floor beside him, not touching him yet, just present. "You didn't force me," she said. "That doesn't mean I didn't use you," he replied. The bitterness slipped in then, subtle, directed inward. He shook his head once. "I spent years being erased. I told myself this wasn't revenge, that it was necessary." He exhaled slowly. "But some nights I can't tell the difference." Silence filled the kitchen, honest, heavy. After a moment, Catherine reached for his hand. He didn't pull away, but he didn't grip back immediately either. It took a second. Then his fingers tightened around hers. Not strong, just enough. "I'm tired," he admitted. 3 words, more vulnerable than any confession. She leaned her head lightly against the cabinet behind them. "Then we rest," she said. Outside, the cameras kept flashing. Inside, for the first time, he allowed himself to close his eyes. Later that night, the mansion was still surrounded by reporters. Catherine sat on the steps beside Elijah, lights flashing, microphones shouting questions. Someone asked if she regretted the marriage. She answered honestly, "I regret waiting this long to listen." Someone asked Elijah if this had all been revenge. He shook his head. "Revenge wants destruction," he said. "This wanted exposure." Catherine turned to him. So that was the plan? He met her eyes. It was the only way power would stay in the room. Silence fell between them. Not comfortable, not hostile. Honest. For the first time, Catherine Whitmore understood something she had spent her life avoiding. She hadn't married beneath her. She had married into accountability. And there was no going back. The fall was faster than Catherine expected. Within weeks, everything she had built unraveled with a speed that felt almost surgical. Accounts were frozen pending investigation, properties were seized, partnerships dissolved overnight. The name that once opened doors now closed them. The mansion was almost empty. Boxes lined the hallway. The staff had already been dismissed. The silence wasn't peaceful anymore. It was hollow. Catherine still alone in the boardroom replica she had built inside the house, the private conference space she used when she didn't want to commute downtown. The long glass table reflected the ceiling lights perfectly, untouched, immaculate. She walked to the head chair, her chair. For years, this seat had meant certainty, decisions, control. Now it meant evidence. She pulled it out slowly and sat down. The leather still remembered her posture. On the table lay a single magazine, the cover from 3 years ago. Catherine Whitmore, the woman who builds the future. She picked it up. Her own smile stared back at her, confident, composed, invincible. She traced the edge of the headline with her thumb. "I didn't build it," she whispered. Her voice cracked before she could stop it. The sound startled her. She tried again. "I didn't build it." Her breathing grew uneven. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just human. She flipped through the pages. Photos of ribbon cuttings, smiling children in front of housing developments, quotes about impact and innovation. She stopped on one image, a neighborhood redevelopment project she now knew had displaced hundreds. Her name sat beneath it in elegant font. She pressed the magazine shut, harder than necessary. For the first time, there was no audience, no board, no donors, no cameras waiting to interpret her expression. Just her, and the version of herself she had believed in. Her shoulders shook once. Then again, a single silent sob escaped before she covered her mouth with her hand, as if someone might still hear. "I was so proud," she said into the empty room. The words were raw, almost confused. She looked at the head chair again. Slowly, deliberately, she stood. Then she pushed it back under the table. Not gently, not violently, just final. When she turned to leave, she didn't look back. She moved out of the mansion quietly. No press release, no goodbye tour. Just a few suitcases and a silence that felt heavier than any crowd. Elijah watched her pack without saying much. He had learned not to interrupt moments that needed to happen on their own. When the last bag was zipped, she sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the floor. "So this is it," she said finally. "I'm officially nobody." He leaned against the doorway. "You're free." She laughed softly. "That's one word for it." They didn't leave together, not because of anger, not because of distance, because some things needed space to breathe. The hearings began in early spring. Catherine sat in rooms that smelled like old paper and consequence. Lawyers spoke in careful phrases. Prosecutors asked questions that peeled layers away. She answered everything. When asked why she hadn't noticed what her money was doing, she told the truth. She said speed had felt more important than understanding, that she had trusted the systems she benefited from. When asked why she chose to speak now, she didn't hesitate, because silence finally felt heavier than losing everything. Elijah testified too. He spoke without bitterness, without embellishment. He explained the patterns, a process, the intentional complexity designed to exhaust anyone without power. When someone asked whether he had targeted Catherine deliberately, he paused. He said, "I targeted access. She happened to be willing to open the door." That answer traveled far. Public opinion split in strange ways. Some painted Catherine as a fallen saint, others as a fool who destroyed herself for a cause she didn't fully understand. She stopped reading the commentary. Instead, she volunteered. Legal clinics, housing centers, places where her name meant nothing and her hands meant everything. At the clinic, Catherine stayed near the intake table at first, organizing paperwork, answering procedural questions, controlling what she could. Elijah moved differently. He didn't hover, didn't dominate. He crouched when people sat, lowered his voice when they were embarrassed, waded through silence instead of filling it. A woman in her 60s slid eviction papers across the table with shaking hands. I don't understand this," she whispered. Elijah read the document once, then again. He didn't rush. "They're betting you won't respond," he said gently, "but you have 14 days, and they filed this wrong." The woman blinked. "Wrong?" He nodded, already pulling a pen from behind his ear. He circled a line. "This clause doesn't apply to subsidized units. They're hoping you don't know that." Her shoulders slowly straightened. Catherine watched something happen in real time. Not charity, restoration. The woman reached for Elijah's hand without thinking. She said, "Thank you," like the word meant oxygen. He squeezed her hand once and smiled, not proud, not performative, certain. Later, when the room thinned out, Catherine approached him. "That was precise," she said. He shrugged lightly. "The law's predictable. People just weaponize complexity." She studied him more closely now. The confidence, the ease, the authority he never announced. "You weren't erased," she said quietly. Elijah looked at her. "Yes," he replied, "I was." She shook her head. "No," she said, "they tried to bury you. They underestimated what survives underground." Something flickered in his expression then. Not strategy, recognition. The rain had started outside, tapping lightly against the clinic windows. A young volunteer rushed in, flustered. "We're short a chair." Without hesitation, Elijah walked across the room, grabbed one, and carried it over. Small act, no audience. Catherine felt it in her chest. This wasn't exposure. This wasn't a mirror. This was a man who rebuilt dignity in inches. When he returned, slightly damp from the doorway, a drop of rain slid from his temple down the side of his face. Without thinking, Catherine reached up. Her fingers brushed his skin, just to wipe it away. The touch lasted half a second too long. They both stilled. The room around them kept moving. Neither of them did. Something shifted. Not dramatic, not explosive, but irreversible. She pulled her hand back first. "I didn't know," she said softly. "I know," he replied. And for the first time since this began, the silence between them wasn't strategic. The world kept moving, but the air between them had changed, and they both knew it. The first time someone asked her to make coffee instead of make a decision, she almost cried. Elijah noticed. "You okay?" he asked. She nodded. "I think so. I just didn't know how tired I was." He smiled. "Power does that. It keeps you busy enough not to feel the weight of it." They worked side by side now, not as symbols, not as a headline, but as people. Some days were awkward, some days quiet, some days full of laughter that surprised them both. They didn't talk about the marriage much. It was still there, legally, technically, but it no longer defined the shape of their days. One evening, after a long clinic shift, they sat outside on folding chairs, watching the sun drop behind a row of old buildings. Catherine broke the silence. "If I hadn't married you," she said quietly, "none of this would have happened." He considered that. "If you hadn't married me," he replied, "someone else would have, or nothing would have changed. Either way, the truth was waiting." She looked at him. "Do you ever wish it had been different?" He smiled gently. "Different doesn't mean easier." She nodded. Then she asked the question she'd been carrying for months. "Did you ever think about walking away after everything came out?" He met her eyes. "Every day," he said, "and every day I stayed." She swallowed. "Why?" "Because for the first time," he said, "someone with power didn't flinch when it cost them." The final ruling came quietly. No dramatic courtroom scene, no gavel slam, just documents, decisions, sentences. Some people went to prison, others settled. Many names faded into footnotes. Catherine Whitmore never returns to her old world. She didn't want to. Instead, she funded one last thing with what remained. Not a foundation, not an empire, but a small legal education program for people who'd been erased the way Elijah had. She asked him to lead it. He hesitated. "I'm not sure they'll let me," he said. "They will," she replied. "They don't get to erase you twice." Years later, there were no cameras, just a modest community center, folding chairs, nervous students. Elijah stood at the front, explaining the law the way he always had, patiently, clearly, without arrogance. Catherine watched from the back, smiling. Afterward, they walked outside together. The air was warm, the street noisy in a familiar, comforting way. She stopped and looked at him. "If I asked you to marry me again," she said quietly, "not as a statement, not as a shield, but as a choice." He raised an eyebrow. "You're terrible at small questions." She laughed. "I know." He thought for a moment. "Only if you're ready to stay nobody," he said. "No platforms, no armor." She reached for his hand. "I already am, and I've never felt more seen." He squeezed her hand once. Not carefully, not strategically, just certain. They walked on together, not as a headline, not as a lesson, but as two people who had finally learned the cost of truth and decided it was worth paying. Some stories aren't just entertainment, they're a mirror. If this story touched you even a little, don't scroll away. Like this story if you believe truth is worth the cost. Share it with someone who isn't afraid to question power. And subscribe, because stories like this remind us that change doesn't start loud, it starts brave. And before you go, ask yourself one thing. If telling the truth cost you everything, would you still tell it? See you in the next story.
The story of Catherine and Elijah teaches us that true strength isn't measured by wealth, status, or the control you hold over others. It is measured by the courage to face uncomfortable truths, the patience to understand people beyond appearance, and the integrity to act rightly even when the world misunderstands you. Power is fleeting, but the impact of empathy and honesty lasts. So let me ask you something. If telling the truth costs you everything, would you still tell it? I hope you enjoyed watching this video as much as I enjoyed writing it. If it's your first time on our channel, please do not forget to subscribe, like and share this video. And also don't forget to turn on the notification bell so you will be the first person to see a new video when we upload it. Thank you for watching. Stay blessed and have a great day.